Thank you so much to Lab Central, to NEB for hosting this event, and to all of you for coming out to talk about this very important topic, laboratory waste. So how many people here actually work in a laboratory? Just have an idea. Oh, great, almost everybody, wonderful. All right, so then you know that as scientists, I myself was formerly a neuroscientist, that as scientists we are taught to question everything, right? Every result. I'll never forget I was in a lab meeting looking at a paper that had been published by a Nobel Prize winner, and my PI goes, I'm just not so sure about figure 4, right? We question everything except our own behavior in the lab. And this goes for myself included when I worked in the lab. I was taught to do things a certain way, and I continue to do them throughout my career. And I never really looked back and thought, well, why is it that we do this in this particular way? And so that's what prompted the title of this presentation, There Is No Why in Waste. And where that comes from is that when you really step back and think about why it is that you're doing something, oftentimes you're able to identify inefficiencies and opportunities for improvement that lead to a reduction in waste. And if you were doing that in the first place, there really would be very minimal waste associated with operating a lab. So I'm very excited to share with you some practical things and to kick off this conversation for the rest of the day of ways that we can reduce waste in labs. As Nicole mentioned, I'm the CEO of a nonprofit called My Green Lab. We are based in California, though we do work across North America and actually a bit now in Europe and Asia as well. And our mission is to build a culture of sustainability through science. And what that means practically is that we work with scientists to help them change the culture of research towards a more sustainable culture, looking at both environmental, social, and economic sustainability. So we look at all three of those. Today, we're really going to just focus on environmental sustainability, and we're going to look at the four main areas that our nonprofit focuses on: disposal, energy, water, and chemistry. So when we think about waste, most people think about material waste, right, disposal. But it turns out there's opportunities for conservation in energy and water, as well as in the chemistry that we use in the lab. Though we only have about 20 minutes today, I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on disposal because I think that's what most of us are here to learn about, right? I'll spend some time on energy and water, and I'll leave chemicals, but I'll be back in the booth. There's a table back there later this afternoon if anybody wants to talk more about any of these in more detail. So has anybody really in this room thought about the energy, water, or waste out of labs? Has anybody really contemplated that? Oh, a few people, great, okay. So I'm going to give you some statistics just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what the environmental impact is for laboratories. So this study came out in Nature. It was a very small little blurb in Nature in about 2016, I think it came out, showing that labs throw away an estimated 12 billion pounds of plastic annually worldwide. That number is so large, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around, right? So I did some calculations. That's equivalent to an area 23 times the size of Manhattan, ankle deep in plastic. That's a lot. That is a whole lot. And that, of course, doesn't include the other things that we throw away, the gloves, the styrofoam coolers, et cetera. So there's a big opportunity here. I think this is the most visible when we work in a lab. But there are other things that are also pretty staggering. So in terms of energy consumption, labs consume about 10 times more energy than office spaces, which is huge. And if you look to see where that's broken down, we did a really nice study in 2015 demonstrating that laboratory equipment accounts for about 20 to 25% of that. So from the pie chart, it looks like, okay, that might be pretty substantial, but it might help to contextualize this a bit. When I say 20 to 25%, I mean 2 to 5 homes worth of energy per lab is how much is attributed to by the equipment. So it's pretty significant. And the good news is this is something that you have control over, as opposed to the rest, which is the ventilation, lighting, which as scientists we have a little bit less control over. Same thing true with water. So water, about 4 times more than office spaces, and again, about 25% of that is something that you have control over lab processes. So things like the single pass cooling, the autoclaves, the millicue water, etc. So it's a lot, right? But the good news is it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, it'd be one thing if we just said, right, this is what it costs to do the research, and that's fine if that's what it really is. But it really doesn't have to be this way, so let's go through some concrete examples of what we can do to make things a little bit different. So when I look at a lab now, I don't see it the way I used to see it when I was working in labs. I see it as opportunity. I see opportunities for energy, for water, for waste reduction, and I'm hoping by the end of this talk, you'll start to see the lab a little bit differently as well. Let's start with energy. I'm going to give you just 2 examples of really, really simple things that you can do in your lab that help conserve energy and electricity that are very, very easy to do and cut down on waste. The first one is turning off equipment when not in use and turning it off at the end of the night. This one's really, really easy, and I'm not sure what the culture is here, but I know that for myself, I always left the water bath going. I would always leave the tissue culture hood on during the day. I never thought about turning these things off at night. But I wouldn't do the same thing at my house. I wouldn't leave the oven running during the day just so when I came back at night, I would be able to make dinner right away. But I would do that with the heating blocks and the water baths and never think about it. It turns out if we, as a community, were to turn off these pieces of equipment at night, we could save, this is unbelievable, it would be the equivalent of offsetting the CO2 emissions associated from burning 60 million pounds of coal every year. Think about that, just from turning off equipment. That's how much equipment we have in labs and how much energy it's consuming collectively. So just doing something this simple can have a profound impact. Similarly, if we think about freezers and cold storage, this is another area where we can have a really big impact. One single -80 freezer, the older models, use as much energy as a home. So about 20 kilowatt hours a day. Now there are newer models that are energy efficient and Energy Star rated, which is fantastic. But if you have one of those older models, you're running a home every day with that freezer. That's a lot. So one of the things that we recommend people do is to adjust the set point of those freezers. And it goes back to that question of asking why. When I first started working in the lab, they were set to -70. I was taught to call them -70s. Then they became -80s. Why? Now there's some that are being sold for -96. Why? There have been no studies demonstrating that -70, -80s, -96 is actually better for samples. And in some cases, samples are really fine at -70. If you set these to -70, you can save 30% of the energy. It's really substantial. And the compressor doesn't have to work as hard, which means that the freezer lasts longer, which also saves on material waste in the end of life. So this is something that's really easy to do. Also, less easy, but very important, is cleaning out the freezers. I'm 100% sure that my samples from grad school are still in that freezer. 100% sure of it. Nobody has any idea what they are. They're all cryptically labeled, and I'm sure they'll be in there until that PI retires. The consequence of that is that we have now multiple freezers storing things that we don't need anymore. So going back and just simply cleaning them out can make it so that you don't have to keep buying new equipment. So that's good. That saves a lot of money and it saves a lot of energy. We run a competition to this effect called the Freezer Challenge. We run it every year. It's called the International Laboratory Freezer Challenge because people participate from all over the world. This freezer challenge in the last 2 years has saved 6 million kilowatt hours energy, which is significant. That's the equivalent of taking about 850 homes off the grid, just completely gone. All from doing the best practices that I mentioned. I would encourage you to sign up. Sign up is started. The competition runs through May, so you have plenty of time to sign up and be a part of it. And there are really great prizes, including the winning labs photo in Nature, which is pretty cool. I was very excited when I got my photo in there because I sent it to all my friends who were still in the lab, and I said, see, it was a lot easier than you thought to get into Nature. You were still working in there, but I figured out a way around it. So I would highly encourage you to participate in this if you can and if you have cold storage units.
So that means that you have to measure?
You don't have to. We do all the estimates based on the information you provide. So we've done enough metering to know how much energy gets saved from certain actions. Yeah. Okay, so I said I was just going to briefly touch on energy. I'm going to briefly touch on water. So I tried to think of what would be the most universally applicable thing with water because I know that everybody's processes are a little bit different in what their experiments are. But one that I think most people use are autoclaves. These use a lot of energy and a lot of water. I like this photo because this is from the 50s, and it really shows that while we've managed to do a little bit of improvement on autoclaves from the 50s, most of the ones that we use aren't much different than the ones in this photo. So we did some metering studies with the University of California, Riverside, and demonstrated that the traditional autoclaves, shown here in teal, are using about 84 kilowatt hours a day, which is about 4 homes worth of energy for one autoclave, and about 650 gallons of water a day, which is equivalent to 8 bathtubs full of water. So that's a lot. There are some things we can do with a traditional autoclave, including consolidating loads, putting it into standby mode, right? Don't leave that on all the time if you can avoid it. And the other thing that you can do is, you'll see here in the yellow, there are newer models that are meant to be energy and water efficient. So again, this starts back to the question of why. Why did you purchase the autoclave that you purchased? Did you think through its efficiency? Did you try to identify opportunities for energy and water efficiency? Is it the right size for what you need? If you're just autoclaving small boxes of pipette tips, for example, you might not need something that you could fit a whole person into, right? And I think that tends to be the case, is people just buy whatever they had before without really thinking it through. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to water. Obviously, there's a lot here, right? And our website has a tremendous amount of information if you're curious to explore energy and water further. But we're going to move now on to material waste. I found this on the internet and I thought it is both amusing and highly disturbing all at the same time. So that was a good introduction to waste, because there's some really great things that are happening in this place, but generally the packaging waste in labs is quite disturbing. So when we think about waste, I think most of us are at a similar age. We were all brought up with the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra, right? We're going to put reduce to the side for the moment and just talk about some reuse and recycle programs, and then we'll go back to reduce. So some really great programs that we found for reuse include reuse of styrofoam coolers, which I hope everybody here knows that NEB has a phenomenal styrofoam cooler take-back program, as does Millipore Sigma. If you are not participating in those programs, I highly encourage you to send them back your styrofoam coolers, because they reuse them. And that's really the best life for this, rather than trying to recycle it. In addition, you happen to live in a wonderful place where there are a lot of startups who often will need styrofoam coolers. So a really good way of reusing them is finding a company that's already shipping things in styrofoam and giving them your old coolers to use instead. Packing peanuts can be reused similarly. Glassware, something we don't often use anymore in the lab, but is a really viable alternative for a lot of the applications for 50 mil tubes or 15 mil conical tubes. One really good example that I can take from my own experience, I used to do a lot of DNA and RNA extraction, and I would always use the Qiagen kits with the 50 mil conical tubes. And I realized one day, what am I doing? I'm wasting 8 to 10 conical tubes every time I run this extraction, and just throwing them away. And I started using instead a glass cylinder, a 50 mil cylinder, and saved all that plastic waste, and just had to wash out a cylinder at the end. And it just made perfect sense, but it's just, again, it's one of those practices that if you don't think about it for a second, you just kind of get into the rhythm and the habit of doing something. And finally, tip boxes. I've seen so many creative uses for tip boxes. I'm sure most of you are reusing them, but I always like to put that on there in case you haven't thought about fun ways for reusing tip boxes. I used to use them for the holidays, giving cookies and candy and things in tip boxes to people, which disturbs the people who weren't in the lab, but my lab mates always really appreciated it. And on recycling. So lab plastics, and I think we're going to spend some time in the panel really talking through and diving into lab plastics, because we're in a very challenging place right now, in that now that China isn't accepting our plastic, it's really hard for us to recycle these types of plastics. However, having said that, there are still opportunities for recycling lab plastics, which I would highly encourage you to take advantage of. Nitrile glove recycling has also become more popular in the last 5 years. Starting with Kimberly-Clark, they had a glove recycling program that started about 5 or 6 years ago called RightCycle. That was through a company called TerraCycle, who now has their own program that will take any brand of nitrile gloves, and they're located pretty close to here. I think they're in New Jersey. And then I just heard exciting news that Medline is also starting a glove recycling program. So I think we're going to start to see glove recycling become very common in the labs, which is wonderful. It's taken us some time, but I think we're almost there yet. Yeah?
These nitrile gloves, they're contaminated gloves? They're accepted, or what kind of gloves are we talking
That's a good question. So just to repeat it for everybody, the question was, what are they accepting? Do they accept contaminated gloves? So no, they don't accept anything that would be considered biohazardous. They are accepting things with chemicals on them, but I think it's worth thinking that through, what kind of chemistry you're using, because the process is to cryogenically freeze them, and then they're made into filler material for bumpers and car doors and things like that. So it's not something that necessarily somebody would touch, but you don't want to be sending them something that you yourself wouldn't feel comfortable touching again. Any other questions about that? Okay. So Corning has a wonderful take-back program. If you use Corning products for any of your tissue culture or cell culture work, they will take back all of their packaging. And I think I've heard that they'll even take back some competitor packaging, although I would confirm with them to make sure that that's true. But they take anything that's Corning for sure back. So that's a wonderful program. And you can stuff a lot of those Steris pipette wrappers into a box. So send all that back to Corning. Millipore Sigma will recycle their Millicue water filters through a company called Triumvirate, who will be speaking, I think, third, so that'll be really nice to be able to hear from them. But do recycle those filters if you have them. Of course, if you have electronic waste, recycle that, including batteries. And then solvents are the last thing I just wanted to bring up, because this is something people don't tend to think about, but there are opportunities for solvent recycling, particularly acetone recyclers are really common. I've seen xylene recyclers. So keep in mind that if you're using a lot of a particular solvent, there might be an opportunity as a community to start recycling that and reusing it. Okay. So when it comes to reduce, we have to think upstream and a little outside the box, right? Because if we're going to reduce the material that's coming into the lab, we have to figure out what it is that we're purchasing and make better choices on the procurement side. And up until really recently, that was hard to do because environmental claims by manufacturers were really hard to verify. A really good example that I like to use is when we first started the nonprofit, I remember leafing through a catalog and I saw a green leaf next to ethidium bromide. And I thought, that's interesting. In what way is ethidium bromide sustainable? So I called up and I said, why does this have a green leaf next to it? And they said, oh, we reduced the packaging by 20% over last year. And I thought, cool. I mean, that's great. That isn't what people are looking for when they're trying to find sustainable products necessarily. So we spent quite a lot of time trying to develop a label that would help provide some guidance on how to buy things that are more sustainable. And that is called the ACT label. So we launched it last year. It stands for Accountability, Consistency, Transparency. And you read it like a nutrition label. So at the moment, it's not prescriptive. It's not saying this product is more sustainable than that. But it simply provides information about what the environmental impact of a product is to give you some guidance so that you can purchase products that are more sustainable if that's what you choose to do. So I'm going to zoom in on this because you're pretty close, but usually people can't see that far away. So we look at 3 different aspects of the life cycle of a product. We look at manufacturing, and I'm not going to run through all of these because all of this is on our website and I'm going to be around so you can always ask. But we look at the manufacturing impact of a product, and we look at the use phase of a product and the end of life of a product and its packaging. And we give everything a score on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning the lowest environmental impact and 10 being the highest. So if you're interested in packaging, for example, you would look for a product that would have a score, let's say, of a 1 or a 3, and then you would know that that packaging was something that was readily recyclable. And when we say it's recyclable, we mean it's recyclable in Oklahoma City, right? It's not that it's recyclable in California, because that's not readily recyclable. Then compare that to a product where packaging might be a 10, which would be something that you can't recycle and has to go to landfill, as an example. So this is how we've been trying to make it easier for people to reduce the environmental impact of the things that they purchase and reduce waste from the outset by buying products with packaging and products themselves that have an end of life that either goes back to the manufacturer or is in some way actually recyclable. So I've listed the vendors here who have started to participate. So we have Cool LED, Eppendorf, Millipore Sigma, Priorclave, and Thermo Scientific Nalgene, their Nalgene product lines, have labels at the moment. And in the coming next few months, we should have labels from Chart, Labcon, who is here in the back, Mycronic, and Miele. So we're starting to increase the number of products. If this is important to you, ask your suppliers to obtain the label. As you've heard, it's really not that expensive. $4,000 for a product family is not something that is cost prohibitive for anybody. And it took us a few years to do some market research to get to a price point where we knew it would be something that people could do. Ask for it, and then that will allow us to have more and more transparency around what we purchase and ultimately get us to a place where our nonprofit can then say, look, we've now analyzed 15 different types of pipette tips. Here are the ones that are the most sustainable. And that's really the end goal for all of this. So with that, I want to leave you with this quote because I find it very inspiring both as a scientist and as somebody who's working in sustainability. You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. And everybody who works in science, I think, has made that choice to really make a significant difference and impact on the planet. And I'd like to just encourage you, as you think throughout the rest of this day, what you can do in terms of how you operate your lab so that the difference you make and the impact you have isn't just outward-facing, but is also inward-facing on your research as well. So with that, this is my contact information. As I said, I'll be around. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope this is kicking off the rest of a wonderful day. So thank you.